Alrighty, so this is a continuation of the Philip Callahan interview. Let's go ahead and get it started. Page 33. Joe, I have a whole set of tuning forks. I record each of the tuning forks. I can take the tuning fork and make it work with another fork over here. I can make a tape of that tuning fork and play it turned up and amplified, and it will do the same thing because it's the same frequency. And that's what scares me. Beneficed said he can replicate the same frequency of opium from Los Angeles and broadcast it over the telephone and make a guy go higher than a kite in New York. Phil, sure, everything is a frequency. That's all it is. You can record anything you want and make it do good or make it do bad. People were tortured just by having a drop of water hit a certain surface, which creates a certain sonic sound that would drive people crazy. They have been tortured with a drop of water creating an ultrasonic frequency just by hitting the right surface. Joe, well, I think the understatement of the year was the author firmly believes that this work is his most important and he can save agriculture worldwide by Dr. Phil Callahan. I think that says it all. Phil, yep. Well, a lot of people are still buying that book. Joe, I buy them by the case. Once in a while, the ones you have autographed for me get away. This one hasn't even been signed. You can sign it for me. Phil, I can sign it right now. Joe, I try to keep them at home. I buy them by the case from you. I put them out all over. I have a half dozen at the biosphere where they were working up there. A couple of Chinese PhDs were working up there, and they took this book back to China with them. That's why they're ordering paramagnetic from me. They are starting a place in Loma, China, which is very similar to Arizona. They're putting a big glass dome over in China. You've signed almost all my books. I've got every book you ever put out. Thank you. You've got some books you haven't published. Phil, I've got a whole stack of books around here somewhere. Joe, oh, I have to share with you another thing. Dr. Halstead, during the last part of his life, wrote a book on coral calcium, a whole book. He sent it to me and I read the transcript, then wrote back to him. By then, it had gone to print. It had gone to print. I said that if you take the coral calcium and blow it apart with sound instead of pulverizing it, the material will be cellular assimilated. It wouldn't hurt to add a little lignits and iron oxide. Let me just turn on my phone here. Iron oxide. He followed through with the suggestion and reported that the growth on the stuff, as well as the animals that he fed it to, were unbelievable. The stuff assimilated. It didn't pass right through the system. Phil, the funny thing is when you tell this to a veterinarian, they go right home and use it. When you tell that to an MD, they look at you like you're crazy. The vet will go right home and go to work on it. Joe, so most of these medicines that we're making are beaten, hammered, ground, and compounded. The vitamins and minerals are ruined. It's so easy to blow them apart. Tesla was the one that started using sound to blow apart minerals. Tesla almost collapsed an entire building down with a police whistle. Sound. Phil, Tesla and Wilhelm Reich were the two geniuses with this sort of thing. They didn't know the physics of it, but they knew what they were doing. Joe, I did not get to meet Tesla. I went up there when I was a young kid, and he didn't like kids. I was trying and he didn't want anything to do with me, but Wilhelm Reich came to Tucson and lived with me for 18 months during the last part of his life. His son was my age and we got along really well. He wrote a couple of things. You'll read a little in that paper about Wilhelm Reich. Phil, Wilhelm Reich was a psychiatrist and he loved children. Tesla was a loner. Joe, in fact, any money Wilhelm Reich made was supposed to go in a children's protection fund. Now he's been dead 50 years as of this year. He said the last part of his research would not be able to be made public until the 50th year. So I'm going to go back to Rainley, Maine, where there's a lady that's in charge of the center. I'll copy everything that I can get I usually drag Marilyn around with me to see what I get where I am going. God, she's put up with me for 50 years. People around Tucson call her Saint Marilyn. Phil, well, my wife's put up with me for 54 years. Like everybody said, she's married a character. Joe, you met your wife in England? Phil, Ireland. Joe, you learned so much in Ireland about the salt and paramagnetics. Phil, I learned a lot from the old stone structures. I used to spend my time going around painting pictures. Joe, you and Christopher Bird had the same kind of exposure in England. He was running the tower stations trying to redirect the airplanes and he was putting those things out. Phil, I did the same thing actually. I was a navigational aids expert and so was he. Joe, he told me one time that they sent him to Germany to do some espionage over there. He went to France. Somebody was going to send in a bunch of plastic explosives. They made a mold in the form of lobsters. Some idiot had the idea to make them red. As they unloaded the lobsters off the boat, the Germans realizing the peculiarity of tossing out cooked lobsters, ended up killing everybody on the boat. A lobster doesn't turn red until you cook it. Phil, you have to cook it to turn it red. They knew something was wrong. Joe, so the Germans killed everybody there. He said he just barely got out alive. Whenever I got to talk to Christopher Bird, he was always interested in what you were doing. A lot of times I didn't know what you were doing because you didn't talk much about anything. Phil, well, I never talked much about World War II until I would get the Medal of Honor. I was an unofficial spy. I sent data back to the OSS before it was the CIA and the Germans occupied France. In fact, that's one of these airplanes, a B 26. Joe, do you do your own artwork? Phil, oh yeah, this is mine. Joe, that's beautiful. Phil, this is all mine. I just finished these for the book. That's a ship that went down. Joe, Art Brown did a lot of his work too. Phil, this is a hen harrier. It depends on if you want to kill birds, rats, or mice. That was the best falcon I ever had. I would hunt rats and mice with him because what would I want to kill a bird for? Then hen harrier is a large bird. I would go around the farm and kick the haystacks so rats would come out. The falcon would get them. We call it a marshal in this country. They call it a hen harrier over there. Same bird found all over the world. Joe, Roy Davis told me about the birds in the Everglades getting iron oxide in their brains for sensing direction. He studied that for a long time and he found out that the gray Spanish moss growing on the trees have an affinity for iron oxide. The moss takes it into the plants. The birds would eat the berries off the Spanish moss and that's how they got the magnetite into their system. Phil, that's exactly true because I've seen them eating those berries. They're getting all the good stuff from the Spanish moss that goes into those berries. I'm going to publish a book that's mostly paintings. Joe, Halstead worked closely with fish and the ocean. He put some huge books together because he had an oceanography degree, but he was still interested in birds. There's not a lot of difference between birds and fish. Phil, birds are actually reptiles. That's why they have scales on their legs. Joe, did you ever see any of Good's books out of England? The books are worth a fortune now. Phil, come on, I'll show you something. Joe, Gold taught me a lot of things, a lot about looking for minerals. Phil, did you ever meet him? Joe, no, never met him. I met people like that met him. Those books are selling for thousands now. Did you know that? Gould wrote about how birds can lead you to minerals. The Gould stuff is selling for a fortune. Marilyn, let Dr. Callahan talk a little bit too. Joe, go ahead. I want you to talk. Marilyn, he does those. Those were beautiful. Phil, this is a hen harrier, which is a bird of Ireland. Marilyn, that's right. I remember reading in your book that you like birds. Phil, I'm getting a Medal of Honor, so I figured I better write a book. This is my old B-26 that I flew. I was a radio gunner, but I flew it too. Joe, he's a hell of an artist, isn't he? Marilyn, that bird is beautiful. Joe, Marilyn, why don't you sit down here and direct a little bit and get him to talk about himself? Marilyn, You had things you were going to ask him. Are you running out of stuff? Phil. A lot of what you see around here is stuff I've done. That's an old German legend. That cross there is inaudible, and of course, and that's a red-headed woodpecker, which is common in Louisiana. It's not too common around here, although I've seen one or two. That's my golden eagle. I trained as I would a falcon. You actually were, Joe said, you actually were able to train it? Oh, that is a nice picture. Phil. Oh yeah, I found the eagle. I had it for about 10 years. Finally, I had to move temporarily and I couldn't keep the eagle in an apartment, so I donated it to the New Orleans Zoo. It must be 40 years old now. It's in the New Orleans Zoo and still alive. They live to be about 50 or 60 years old, but that eagle is still alive in the zoo. At least he was a year or so. At least he was a year ago. Those are in my paintings there. The painting of the Indian is not mine. That was painted by Yazoo. He was one of the great Indian painters. Joe, birds have a close relationship to man more than we realize. The canaries were used to in the mines to warn the men when there were dangerous levels of carbon monoxide. Phil, they always took with them a canary. If they got too much methane and the canary would kneel over, they would take the canary and leave. Joe, what do you think about these new biotoxins that Halstead was developing? Do you think that it would be better to use birds to check them rather than men? Phil, nothing can poison a bird or a snake. I used to have a little grass a snake, a cave snake, about that long. It looks a little bit like a rattlesnake. They don't lay eggs like most snakes, but give birth to live snakes. It was really funny because they got out of their cage once and all of these little ones got out. Once and all these little ones got out. Joe, did you experiment with snakes on biotoxins? Phil, yeah, and I did infrared experimentation with them. Their tongues could detect the heat. Joe, can a snake and bird detect poisoned water and food? Phil, oh yeah, you can't poison a bird. If there are no birds around the water, you know it's no good. Joe, you could pour the water over iron oxide and it would be free of poison. Hmm. Phil, yeah, that's what I did in World War II. When I wanted a drink of water and I would have a rock in my pocket, I would throw it into the canteen and drink it. I never got sick. You just throw a bunch of paramagnetic rocks in the canteen. That's interesting. I could take rocks out of any old ditch, put it in polluted water, and have water. I was a radio commando, and I had to have water. You can live a week without food, but you have to have water. Joe, so you dropped your paramagnetics into your canteen and you had water. Now, why don't they put a couple of these paramagnetic balls in the water canteens for every soldier? Phil, sure, that's why in some ways God has taken care of things. On Memorial Day, I'm going to be on TV. I'm going to be in Washington with the president and getting my Medal of Honor. So I'm going to tell everyone about paramagnetism. Then it will catch on like wildfire because someone with a Medal of Honor will be up there telling them about it and they will believe. The doctors will even start to believe. Joe, paramagnetics is God's gift to man. Why don't you tell about the statues you drilled holes in the bottom and filled with paramagnetics? To Marilyn, he carries it in his pocket all the time. I've never seen him when he hasn't got it in his pocket. Phil, I've had this in my pocket ever since the army. It's filled with paramagnetic rock. It's a novel statue and it's filled with paramagnetic rock. I never catch a cold or get sick or anything. Joe, notice the parallels between Dr. Callahan and Dr. Vogel. They were both very religious. In that one article I gave you today, he put the magnetite iron in oil. He sat down and he looked at it, and he kept thinking about the Virgin Mary, and it formed in the oil. It's in that article. It's unbelievable. Marilyn, you remember that guy that used to come to Tucson? I believe his name was Richard. He put magnetite in ballpoint pen cases and carried them. Phil, yeah, I remember that. Vogel and Reich did the same thing too. That's interesting. He put magnetite in ballpoint pen cases and carried them around. Joe, I still have a William Reich box in Tucson. Joe, oh, Marilyn, oh, you do? Phil, I've built one and it works real good. He used rusty iron oxide coming off of steel wool and stuff like that. I found you're a lot better off to go to the pure oxide from the iron and take the magnetite iron oxide from the magnetite or black paramagnetic sand, Phil. When I was in Ireland, I would take a rusty tin can, scrape all the rusty iron oxide off the tin can. About the same time Elmer's glue came out during the war, I would mix it with the pure iron oxide. I had a little peanut tube and I would use a big square of that and power my own radio. I would carry it behind the hedgerows to make sure no one was following me. Joe, he told me that Elmer's glue, which is the hoof of a horse and is diamagnetic, and iron oxide, which is paramagnetic, and mix them together, you have the perfect deal. Phil, you've got the perfect yin and yang. The Chinese knew all about the yin and yang. They knew that plants were diamagnetic and rocks were paramagnetic. Joe, well, 5,000 years ago, they were using paramagnetics for their compasses. Phil, the first compass had paramagnetic rock. They actually floated. It would float even though it was a rock. It was in diamagnetic water, and the paramagnetic property of it repelled to keep it up. Joe, well, I didn't know that. Joe said, well, I don't know. He's learned so much. He's talked about the pads that he made to wear out of magnetic iron oxide, clay, and salt water. Why was the salt water from sea salt so important? Phil, because it has every natural element that you need for your body. In other waters, salt water is the same as your blood. In other waters? Or maybe they meant in other words. Who knows? Salt water is the same as your blood. Salt water is just blood without hemoglobin. That's why they can substitute saline solution for blood sometimes. Joe, I've got another one to share with you that's really unbelievable. I've taken seaweed, compressed it, used it for a filter, and I can get stuff out of the water that doesn't even assay. This filter will take out minerals, ionics, and colloidals. It will take them all. All you have to do is wash the stuff and clean it up, and you can use it over and over again. Phil, that's all they used on the coast of Ireland. It's almost impossible now because of the chemical companies, but in the old days, that's all they used. They would collect the seaweed left up on the shore, which is what this little vial is. It's carrying terp, and it's carrying seaweed too. That's terp, which they cut in the bog and burn for the bark. Joe, that terp that they burn is moss-like, and it is very close to being lignite. Phil, that's why the old Irish islanders were so healthy. They were burning something close to lignite. It didn't have the sulfur, and so didn't ruin your lungs. Joe, Marilyn, he just said he mixes the iron oxide magnetite with Elmer's glue and paints it on the wall. It creates a Faraday cage. It's a very healthy house, very healthy. There's no stray magnetic radiation. That's interesting. Phil, that's an easy way to do it. Just plaster your walls with it. Marilyn, he likes the Mobius. He puts them all around. Phil, sure. Joe, he's saying that the Mobius is made with these plastics, and audio videotape records all this imagery on them, and these are good, and those are good. And he's saying that Elmer's glue is even better. Phil, you can grind up rock and mix it with Elmer's glue. Then make just about anything you want. You can make a statue out of it or anything you want. I usually just buy a plastic statue and fill it with paramagnetic rock, but you could actually make a statue out of it. Other uses you can use it for would be to place it in every room of the house if you're under high voltage power lines. Spikes that occur with 60 cycle alternation currents are known as rogue electricity, and it wreaks havoc with the body's electromagnetic balance. Magnetite around the house keeps the body in balance electromagnetically. Joe, Black Mountain between Phoenix and Tucson is primarily paramagnetic rock. Every winter it rains or sometimes snows. The mountain's ices over and breaks it up. Then the sediment comes down as black sand. The further they go down, the finer they get. At the base of the mountain, paramagnetic rock has turned into pretty good-sized crystals. Then about 15 miles away, they become fine, very fine crystals. Phil, I'll bet there is good plant life at the bottom of the mountains, Joe. Oh, you can't believe the plant growth in there. Now, that's another thing I want to talk to you about. How does the magnetic iron oxide enhance the soil to the point that you can get by with less water? Phil. Well, that's what happens around here with all this soil around here. Look how green everything is. These trees, everything is really green around here, and yet we only get about 12 inches of rain a year. That's 12 inches like is like 60 inches in Florida because the paramagnetic soil holds the water instead of the water evaporating in 2 or 3 hours. The water evaporates in 2, 3, or 4 days. If you have a puddle of water around here, it takes it days and days for it to evaporate. Joe, the trees pick up this colloidal and ionic iron. Does that increase their ability to take the water through their cellular fiber? Phil, yeah, those little tubules that go up the tree, the smallest ones is called a microtubule. They bring the paramagnetic dirt up through them. You can't grow crops in sand like pure sand on a beach. You have to have paramagnetism in the soil. All good farm soil has to be paramagnetic. That's what has been destroyed with chemical farming. The more chemicals you put on it, the more you have to put on it. The more you have to put on. Joe, I sold 10 and tons of iron one time to the Geo family. Remember? They took it back to Intercourse, Pennsylvania. They were Mennonites. They had clay back there that had never grown anything. They took this magnetite from Arizona and spread it over the clay fields. They took clay that was worthless on its own and turned it into beautiful fields. Phil, a lot of clay is paramagnetic, but just as much of it isn't. A lot of clay is just dead mud. When it rains, it's just dead mud. If you mix paramagnetic rock with it, you have diamagnetism of the clay and paramagnetism of the rock, and you can grow anything in it. My original experiments were just with potted plants. I experimented with how much magnetism to use in each pot. I have notebooks on that. Joe, remember, we did the same thing with Dr. Ricketts. We put paramagnetics paramagnetics in one pot. The paramagnetic pot plants would be double the size of the other plants. Marilyn, he did time released photos of them too. Phil, yeah, time lapse photography shows as a great demonstration of the growth. Marilyn, maybe we ought to do a video of that. Joe, I love the old man, but he passed away. He was in his 90s and passed. I can't get along with the kid. The kid thinks only about money. Phil, points. That's one of the best books I have ever seen. It was written by an English soldier who was captured by the Germans. He had a pet kestrel. The Germans really treated him good because they never saw a guy with a bird on his shoulder that would just sit there all the time. It's a great book. Joe, you read a wide variety of books. Phil, yeah, I've got a little bit of everything up there. Marilyn, have you read The Da Vinci Code? It's a new book out. Joe, Marilyn got that the other day. I gave it to her to read. Phil, here's a picture of paramagnetic tower house. They built a limestone castle on a tower house. It was very energetic. That's my wife's and my living room. That's where I asked her to marry me. Now it's been taken over by the tourist bureau, so it's a hotel now. Marilyn, she told me you went on a world trip before you got married. Phil, yeah, I hiked around the world. Joe, he had just his deep breeches and his overshoes and a few matches in his pocket. Phil, I had a 20-pound knapsack in the canteen. I carried a change of clothes and some granola bars. Joe, the prickly pear cactus in Arizona form white matting on them from the cochineal bug. If you pull it off with a knife and rub it on a piece of white paper, it turns to a royal purple color. It's used as a dye, but if you reduce it down atomically, you'll find that royal purple contains gold. So here's a plant that's extracting the gold from the soil that's showing up in the sponge silk of the bug. The Spaniards knew that. They used to take this for dye and send it back to Spain. Then after they broke the coal down, they got all the colors of the rainbow out of the coal. Maryland. Now, what is this one here about Christ? I noticed it is a Christ-like picture. Phil, that's the Shroud of Turin. That's the image that appeared on the shroud. I took that picture. I'm probably the only man that has touched the tilma of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which is sacred in this country. On the Shroud of Turin, I was asked to come over and do an infrared study on both of them. I did an infrared study on the Virgin of Guadalupe. Joe, was that iron oxide on the Shroud of Turin, or was it red ochre? Phil, it was iron oxide. Obviously, it came from the soil. What happened was when they lay the body on the shroud was a long piece of cloth that folded over his body. On the bottom shows his back. It is on display now in Italy. It is behind glass so people can view it. Joe, but it didn't come from the blood of the body, it came from the soil. Is that why people such as kings and queens in history have been buried in a river? Phil, some of it came from blood, like where it was really white. Apparently, the water and blood were diamagnetic and repelled the paramagnetic. So you have a lot of white spots, but the image itself was red ochre. Joe, what about these people, these kings and queens in China, South America, and even Africa? They buried their royalty in red ochre. Red ochre. Phil, red ochre is considered a sacred soil. It is a sacred chemical, too. It was used for healing as an ancient herbal. Joe, but it doesn't have the healing aspects of magnetite because magnetite is the end of the rusting process and ochre is going that way. Phil, ochre is going that way, but it doesn't make that much difference. You can take magnetite or rust from a metal tin can. Iron oxide is just more paramagnetic than red ochre. Joe, you just get higher CGSs out of the end product. Phil, right. So it slowly becomes highly paramagnetic. Joe, now the blood itself is paramagnetic. Phil, blood itself is paramagnetic, but it's hard to measure that because it's got so much water in it. If you use the CGS meter, it goes diamagnetic because you're measuring the water. It's like a transistor with trace elements of paramagnetism. Joe, if you dehydrate the water and put the powdered blood plasma in, Phil, then it would be the other way around. Then it would be the other way, which I have done by letting the water evaporate. Joe, so you spent a lot of time on the shroud. Phil, oh yeah, I've got a paper on it somewhere. Joe, I'd like to read that sometime. Phil, I thought I had an extra copy around here somewhere. I don't even see one copy of it. I don't know what I did with it. That's a security service award. I got that for working on paramagnetism. The USDA believed me. I didn't have any problem working with the USDA. Joe, that's one of the first EGS meters. Phil, no, it's an antenna. It's diamagnetic. That's a coil of string, so I can see what I'm using for an antenna on the oscilloscope. Joe, I bought a deal from Armand Bickel, the old man from Germany. He did a lot of work for von Braun and a lot of people in space. He designed that little thing to crawl around on Mars, an isotope discriminator. I bought one of his meters. I think your meters are more informative, and I paid $5,000 for that. Phil, yeah, those things are overpriced. It only takes about $50 to $60 worth of electronics to put it together. Sosa makes a $100 profit on it and sells it for 400 and selling. The more people learn about paramagnetism, the better the chance they buy it. Joe, that fellow Marshall bought one. He came out and took one of those little film canisters, but then said, I want all my truck can haul. I want all I can take. You know, I used to give the stuff away. It got too expensive to give away, so I started selling it for a dollar a pound. They don't even say a word. When you sell 10 tons at a dollar a pound, you've made yourself some money. Phil, you've made a lot of money. Joe, pays the mortgage. Phil, but if you're in the business, you have to. Joe, but I've given it away for years and years. Phil, yeah, but you're getting older, so you need some money set aside so you can retire. You can't travel without money. You wouldn't come here without money. It costs money to travel. Joe, damn sure of it. I've learned more from you than I have from Dr. Pi or all the people I've been really close to in all my life. They were really, they were geologists and engineers. They were educated in schools, but you have a kind of street knowledge. I call it real knowledge. Phil, street knowledge is what it is. Nature is my bride. I'm going to write a book and call it Nature is My Bride. Nature has been my left hand besides my wife. Joe, I met Schauberger. Hughes brought him over to, I think they're referring to Victor Schauberger. Hughes brought him over to Houston, and I went down there to talk to him a while. He didn't speak English well. A lot of it got lost in translation. You and he are on the same frequencies. He was saying that fish can actually become paramagnetic and diamagnetic, and they can actually levitate. They can go right upstream. I think that is Victor Schauberger. They can go right up a fall. He said they can be in a flow of water going downhill and go right up it. Phil, right, floating like a balloon up in the air. Joe, he said the movement of the tail creates a vortex around the back of it, and the water that is pushing them down is pushing them up. It's all magnetic. He said that the Shrine River at certain times with the full moon and paramagnetics, rocks on the bottom of the river will actually float. He had the idea that if you waited for the moon to be in the right position and use the gravitational pull of the moon, you can float big hardwood logs out of a flume serpentined. It would not go in a straight flume. It would have to be broken up some way and serpentined. Phil, that's the way the Hindus used to levitate. They would go into a paramagnetic room when the full moon was out. With the force of the moon and the paramagnetic room, they would levitate. Churches were paramagnetic, actually. If you go back and read the literature about some of the people like St. Bernard, they actually levitated while in a paramagnetic church. Those Gothic churches in Old Ireland were all paramagnetic. That's actually what I'm going to look into next, which is pretty interesting. Paramagnetism in cathedrals, or rather Gothic churches, which is interesting. It's going to be the next article I'm going to read. I think the book is called The Divine Blueprint, which I'm reading now. Interesting stuff. Okay. They would go into churches made out of stone and get in a meditative state. They would become so highly diamagnetic, they would be totally relaxed. They became almost completely diamagnetic, and the church just pulls them up. Joe, when the paramagnetics and the stones got pressured on the top of them, there is a piezoelectric effect. That's interesting. Joe, when the paramagnetics and the stones get pressure on the top of them. Okay. Phil, a piezoelectric effect, sure. You've got several different forces working. You've got the piezoelectric effect. You have the gravitational force being overcome by the force between the diamagnetism and the paramagnetism. When all these forces get together, you can actually levitate. That's how the ancient Indians used to levitate. And actually, Phil, in his book, noted that the ancient Egyptians used the pyramids to levitate as well. But I would assume in the same manner. Joe, Vogel Vogel called that the fifth dimension. Phil, that's what it is. It's another dimension when you can levitate. There are still some Indians who can do it. One place they used to do it was in the deserted villages out on the prairies of India, which were all paramagnetic. I have a picture of one around here somewhere. It is a mosque. A mosque was a great place for Indians to levitate. Joe, the Hindus built their mosques with a round dome on the top, and they established an antenna point. Phil, that's what this picture is. It's a round dome with an antenna. The vultures loved to sit up there. All the vultures would congregate up there. The black vulture had about a 10-foot wingspan. It would sit up on top of this mosque. All the lepers would congregate inside the mosque. This mosque was full of leopards. I went in there and slept for a couple of nights surrounded by lepers, even though leprosy is very contagious. Joe, last time you told me that leprosy was coming from the armadillo. Phil, that was based on what I told one researcher. I said you ought to look on the pads of the armadillo feet because armadillo get leprosy. He couldn't figure out why on the pad of their feet. Leprosy is a soil bacteria that clings to their feet as they dig the soil. Joe, will leprosy grow in paramagnetic soil? Phil, oh yeah, that's a real mess. Leprosy is always at the bottom of that cliff. That cliff is all paramagnetic rock, and it washed down to the shore where the leper colony was. The lepers were ostracized and put down there. Of course, the leprosy got worse and worse because they were down there where the soil was loaded with the bacteria. Joe. So the paramagnetics can cause the leprosy, and the paramagnetics can cure the leprosy. Phil. Paramagnetics enhanced the bacteria to the point where anyone that walked barefoot around there would get it. Leprosy is hard to catch until you sustain a cut anywhere the wound makes contact with the soil organism. The farmers in Hawaii will walk barefoot, but if they cut their foot and they walk across that soil, they will catch it. It is a very slow condition. Joe, you treated this stuff with paramagnetics. Phil, yeah, I treat it with paramagnetics. It's the old thing. You treat the disease with the disease. It's a matter of concentrating it in the body and the immune system in the body. The diamagnetism in the body combined with paramagnetism of the rock will cure leprosy. You can cure the disease with the disease, you might say. Joe, a frequency. Phil, a frequency. Yeah, you have a frequency that is out of phase. You have the leprosy frequency and the paramagnetic frequency that is the same frequency, but it is 180 degrees out of phase, so they cancel. Joe, Halstead said the reason we are having so much bad water is the fact that the hydrogen bond has changed its alignment. Phil, it has changed its alignment completely. Probably also a lot of the paramagnetism in the water has been distorted by the waterborne poisons. Joe, won't running water over paramagnetic crystals realign it? Phil, it realigns anything. It always gets rid of whatever is bad for life and enhances what is good. It always works that way. Joe, magnetic crystals are all sharp and they have dual polarity. Phil, right, they have antennas. Joe, so I look at it like if you are trying to clean water with marbles, you'll never get it clean. You have to have sharp points, you clean it. If you have sharp points, you clean it. Phil, if you have sharp points, you clean it, right. Which is why if you take this paramagnetic grain, it's got billions of little antennas because you have so many little sharp points working to purify the water. Joe, I talked to Reiner and 2 or 3 other people from Germany, and your book was the reason those people were treating the Black Forest with paramagnetics. They ground the stuff up and put it on the forest floor. Now, why in the hell they do more of it in Germany if they know it works? Phil, I don't know. Why don't they do it here? The farmers tell us to farm with it here. Leave it down. Leave it down the next day because it's so important. You tell it to the people and there isn't enough money involved to do it. You buy paramagnetic block for $20 a ton and put it on your farm instead of 500 ton, 500 a ton like fertilizer. What is that? You buy paramagnetic block for $20. That's interesting. Let me just copy that. Okay. Joe, when you were at Acres last time, you were up there. I was out there I was up there last few times. I was there waiting for you and you didn't show up. Phil, yeah, I'm going to go this year. Joe, I'll make it this year. Phil, I will. I'll make it this year. They're agreeing. Joe, some of the Amish people wanted to talk to me about paramagnetics. They take you out to supper. What it means is a crock pot in a motel room. But it's good food. Phil, yeah, it's good food. Joe, but anyway, they were talking about this and they were really disappointed that you didn't show up this last time. They're really nice and we talked a lot. Now, they have a bunch of your books, those Amish people. They have their own opinion. Phil, I went to Acres 25 years in a row and I decided, I need to go up there again because there's another generation coming along now talking about this generation. Joe, the fellow that's running Acres is getting old too. Phil, yeah, well, Fred is still young. Fred is in his 50s. Joe, last time I took him out to lunch, he had a little trouble seeing. His eyes are going bad. Phil, his eyes are going bad, yes. Chuck's eyes are really bad now and he's even my age. He's the same age as me, about 81. Fred's only 53. He and his wife and so knock on wood, and so I'll probably go too. Joe, I used to go to that conference of global science in Denver. Yeah, and they had some people up there to talk to. I should fly you over there one of these days to talk to the Breakfast Club. Phil, I'm free most of the time. Just let me know when. You'll have to send a car over for me 'cause I don't drive anymore. Well, if I can help it, that is. I drive sometimes, but I let my wife do most of the driving. Joe, I drive sometimes, but still don't know where I'm going. Phil, the problem is I haven't in years. My wife drives most of the time. I don't really like driving because it's just, well, the thing is, I've done so much driving during World War II while I was in the military. That's why I walked around the world. Joe, I let Marilyn drive all the way here, all the way over here. I see you over there and you got a book on ants. Phil smiles and turns to the book. Yeah, I really like ants. That's a great book. That's funny. Joe, I used to go around the ant hills and pick up a magnifying glass and see what was under the ground. Ants bring your minerals up around the mound. You'll see the copper and silver. Phil, your mounds are coated with alabaster. You'll find that it's coated with pink granite and quartz, and ants go around and collect all the quartz and granite and line the whole hill. Joe, Linda McCain used to put together a conference out in California on magnetics and various different things on all sciences. She'd invite people from all over the world to show up there. And one time we went to her yard. She put me up to at her house. At a nice moment, we had all these pure purdy squirrels all over there, and I took a 5 gallon bucket of iron and poured it in one corner. Poured it one corner. Later, she called me back and says, "You know all those little critters that moved to that corner? You know all those little critters have moved to that corner where the paramagnetics is." Phil, oh yeah. Joe, I gotta tell you a story over there. I went in with a truck and I had 25 gallon buckets weighing about 100 pounds apiece. I went in to try to tell them the value of having magnetic iron oxide as a cold pack on the head or wherever you want it. A guy had a heart attack around the swimming pool, so I went and got my little bucket and, excuse me. So I went and got my little bucket and looked and saw that I had a little dry ice and a cold one, and put one here and the cold one up against the back of his neck. Phil, yeah, that'll do it, laughing. Joe, by the time the ambulance got there, he was already stimulated and back to life. The guy says you ain't getting any of these back. I don't know what they are, but you ain't getting them back. Phil, laughing. You ain't getting them back. Yeah. Joe, so everyone around there, everyone from the science committee were there, and probably 50 people who said, "What was that?" I told them, "Magnetic iron oxide." When they asked where they can get a little, I said, I got a truck sitting right out there in the parking lot. And I says, there are 10 or so buckets out there. 2 hours later, there was not a single grain of sand left. They took every last one of them, and the place had to run out of the little containers they were giving these people. I didn't have anything to show. Phil, you should have saved some. Joe, they had completely filled that place with iron oxide. That made a lot of believers in your deal there. I told a lot of them, and I said, if you really want to know more about it, get a hold of Callahan's book. Phil, yeah. Joe, I printed your name and the title of your book on every piece of paper I handed out. I announced where to get it too. Phil, it's been selling pretty good. According to Acres, I think it'd be going on forever. Joe, I'd like to see you get the that other one out there. How far off are you? Phil, I got most of it. It's scattered around. I just got to put it together and jot stuff here and there. I've got my autobiography, some about paramagnetism, my story written into it and how it works. Don't know what to name it yet. Nature's My Bride is what I was thinking. But Joe, it's a magic miracle. Phil, it's the magic miracle. That's what it is. Joe, everyone knows that MMS is the magic miracle. Phil, yep, the magic miracle is what it is. Joe, hey, hey, hey. Phil, Well, the partnership picked it up. I don't know, the medical profession is still in the chemical age. I don't know, the medical profession is still in the chemical age. But a doctor should have picked it up. Holistic doctors all over the country are using it. Joe, there's a guy named Carter in Las Vegas has made a fortune. I just gave it to him. He made it into pads and he has these people come up to him and he soaks them in water and he adds deuterium in the water, gold, and it's liquid gold. The liquid gold has a tendency to kill pain too. He puts MSM in what in with it so you don't have to taste the DMSO. He calls it anti-aging. Halstead said that all these minerals that I'd give you today are grown in paramagnetic soils and they're herbs. Phil, the herbs. I don't know, I say herbs, I know it's herbs. Joe, you've got to have good soil. Phil, that's right. Joe, he said he'd have to go back into China. You have to travel far where they don't use pesticides. Phil, it's still good earth. In England and China, they still have traditional farmers. The coast is mostly ruined, so you go in 100 miles where they still got good farmland. Joe. Now, Halsey, just before he died, they named two good herb gardens after him. They gave him a big gold piece of metal like that, a really nice piece of metal for his work on herbs. Phil, on herbs, that's right. Joe, that was in the last book he wrote. The biggest improvement we made, I think, was on the coral calcium. You got to be careful about that coral calcium. You can't get it where they've done the radioactive testing. Phil, that's deadly. Joe, remember when that doctor out in California at Scripps that was working with us on that? I did a paper on him up there. That Dr. Martin seeded the ocean with the black iron. We ground the iron down real fine and we mixed it with cotton seed oil and then air dried it using a fan so it would float on the ocean. He found that the algae would grow 27,000 times overnight and watch the whole ocean turn green. Phil, sure, sure, yep, the ocean turns green. Joe, and the whole food chain starts. Phil, that's right. Joe, but Halstead came up with something. He said, Joe, be careful about this because it feeds off other things and it goes out to the algae. It ruins the algae. When it gets to the algae, it gets all over the coral. He said, there's a little oceanic microbe called a titan. I've never heard of it, but a titan has a series of teeth made out of magnetite. So they're magnetic and they eat the algae. They'll eat the algae off the coral and then undermine the coral, which falls over for lack of nutrients out of the bottom, which is why it dies. He said this may be killing more of the coral than you realize. It's back to getting iron. Be careful about trying to improve something that you don't have a bad side effect. Phil, the coral is diamagnetic and you really don't want too much paramagnetism. Joe, well, Marilyn, why don't you talk to him a bit about early life? Marilyn, I've been talking to his wife about it a lot. I get it straight from the horse's mouth. Joe, get him to talk about it a little bit. I asked Mrs. Einstein one time. I said, "You understand the Einstein's theory?" Sure, Albert Einstein, I guess. You know what she said? No, better yet, I understand the Einstein. Phil, yeah, right. Turns to Marilyn. You'll never guess where I was born. Marilyn, where? Phil, Fort Benning, Georgia, in the officers' club. What happened is an interesting story. Marilyn, in the officers' club, huh? Phil, they moved my mother into the hospital when she was ready to deliver, and that evening the hospital was sort of creaking. The more it creaked, the more panicked the colonel that commanded the post got. So he moved right into the room there. My father come home. My father came back, and the 24th Infantry was all black. And so they moved my mother out to the officers' club, and that's where I was born. Not only was I born in the officers' club, I was born among the blacks. That hospital, well, it fell down the next morning. It collapsed. Marilyn, wow. Phil, I got that from my sister. I remembered that. Marilyn, you can also say you brought down the house. Phil, yeah, I brought down the house. That's what my sister used to say, and I'd say, what are you talking about? So she finally told me the story. My mother told her, but she never told me. My father, who lived to 63, knew and never told me. He smoked himself to death. My mother lived to be 89. She comes from a generation where the dead ancestors used to take quinine. Quinine? So my mother would take it when she got pregnant. Actually, the drugstore sold it to them. Joe, it's still the main deal over in India. India still does it. Phil, all the drugstores that make Senesi sell quinine sell it sterilized. Marilyn, you think she got her minerals that way? Phil, it's the paramagnetics in it for the crazy deliveries. Joe, now, wasn't the great epidemic, the influenza epidemic, started from burning common horse manure? Phil, in the air. Joe, a lot of airborne toxins get in the air. Got it in the air. Phil, yep, got it in the air. Joe, became an airborne toxin. Phil, an airborne toxin. Phil, there's so few airborne toxins in the air around here because of the soil being so paramagnetic. You can't get sick around here even if you tried. Joe, what do you think about these chemicals, chemtrails that's running around about there? They're trying to keep the earth from warming up. You think they're taking a micromagnetic iron and micro aluminum and dispersing it up in the air to stop it from warming? Phil, it might work. It might slow down what's happening. Joe, they're experimenting all over. Phil, this industry is creating so much methane that it's destroying the atmosphere. Actually, it gets clear up 300 miles into the atmosphere. Joe, and if the ocean gets a little warmer, the methane gets frozen down there at the bottom and it melts. Phil, if it gets another degree warmer, we'll get into real trouble. Scientists know that. There are laws in most states. I don't know about New Mexico, but I think New Mexico has a law too. They have to cut down on their methane emissions. Joe, well, we haven't talked much about politics. What do you think about our president? Phil, not too much. He's not an ecologist. Joe begins to laugh. Kerry cares about ecology. Bush is alright, but he ain't no ecologist. That's the whole problem. He's an oil man. That's the whole problem. Joe, he appropriated millions of dollars for hydrogen, but he said he'd have to make it out of oil. Phil, yeah, that's the problem. It's money madness. I don't know whether Kerry is so money mad or not. Joe, he married enough of it. Phil, I think Kerry is probably alright. I think he's more of an ecologist than Bush. If Bush had learned something from his father, I know both of them. I know all three of them, but I don't know Kerry at all. I know Clinton very well. I went to school with him. Joe, I didn't know that. Phil, we went to school together and we taught together. I've had 40 or 50 breakfasts with President Clinton, I guess. But he was an ecologist too. Bush, he's totally oblivious to and is destroying the environment. Joe, Clinton was smart. Clinton had a good mind. Phil, yeah, he was smart. He was a brilliant guy. Joe, he had a pretty big ego. Phil, yeah, that's for sure. Damn straight on that. Yeah. Joe, that's how he'd got the best of them. Phil, yeah, I was the only one to put his ego down too. We went to school together and taught together, so he knows me real well. Joe, he gave us the largest surplus of money we ever had. Phil, he did what the Republicans always come to do. What they did was drive us into debt. That's liberals, whatever you want to call them. Clinton came along, and that's the only time this country's ever been out of debt. He knew that. He knew what he was doing. He's an economist. Marilyn, I came here to see if you guys are getting a little hungry. Joe, take you to lunch? Phil, sure. Joe, okay. Marilyn, but you know, there's an hour ahead of us, and my clock says 1 o'clock, but it's really 2 o'clock. Joe, to Marilyn, I'm going to talk to him tomorrow. To Phil, your wife says you have good days and bad days. I'll stay when you have a good one. Phil, I'll go to lunch with you. Oh, because I need a cup of coffee now. Marilyn, okay. Joe, we had ribs last time we were here. Let's all go down to the rib house over here. Phil, yeah, that's right. It's right there. Joe, I could find the rib house, but I couldn't find your house. Laughs. Ask your wife to go with us. Ask your wife to go with us. Marilyn, she's getting dressed now. She's getting ready to go. Joe, okay. Part 2. I think we can stop here for now. See you guys next time. Page 66. Wow, 3366. That's what a coincidence.